They ignored me for 10 years, then showed up at my mansion uninvited. I spoke calmly at the door and watched every ounce of color drain from their faces. The marble floor in my entryway gleamed beneath the crystal chandelier just as the intercom chimed from the front gate. It was one of those lazy October Sundays where sunlight spills through big windows, turning everything into a golden, picture-perfect scene. I hadn't been expecting anyone. My housekeeper Elena had the weekend off, and my friends all knew better than to show up without a heads-up. I set my cup of Earl Grey on the table and walked over to the security panel to check the feed. On the screen, 3 figures stood by the gate. There was something oddly familiar about their posture, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I pressed the intercom. Yes. A woman's voice came through, hesitant. Ryan, it's Claire. Claire Delgado. We were hoping we could talk to you. My breath hitched. I pressed the gate release and made my way toward the front door, the sound of my shoes echoing across the imported Italian stone. Standing there on my porch were 3 people I hadn't laid eyes on in 10 years and 4 months. Not that I'd been keeping count. Claire Delgado, my old best friend from kindergarten, looked older now, with faint lines etched around her eyes and highlights that didn't have the same salon polish she used to swear by. The fake designer purse slung over her shoulder told me more than her awkward smile did, and I could tell she was doing her best not to stare at the marble columns framing my entrance. Beside her stood Eric Lawson, the guy I dated through college until he decided I didn't fit into his big plans. His hair was thinning now, and a soft belly pushed against his suit jacket, which didn't quite fit right anymore. The confidence he used to wear like armor had faded into something closer to self-consciousness. Then there was Melanie Delgado, Claire's younger sister, who had once been part of our tight-knit crew before everything went south. She clutched a worn leather purse, her gaze flicking between me and the circular driveway where my Tesla and Mercedes sat gleaming in the afternoon light. Hi, Ryan, Claire said, her voice smaller than I remembered. We were hoping we could talk to you. I stood there for a second just taking them in. The same 3 people who had pushed me out of their lives piece by piece, who'd ignored every message and call until I finally stopped trying. And now, here they were, standing on the steps of my mansion in the Hollywood Hills, looking like they didn't belong. Well, I said evenly, this is a surprise. The last time I'd seen any of them was at Eric's engagement party, 10 years and 4 months ago. I just graduated from UCLA with a computer science degree, while the rest of them seemed to have their futures neatly lined up. Claire had landed a big marketing job, Melanie was working at some high-end art gallery, and Eric had joined his father's investment firm. I still remember showing up in a dress shirt from Target, feeling totally out of place among their designer clothes and talk about European vacations. When I tried to share my idea for a tech startup, the app I'd been quietly building in my spare time, they'd smiled politely, changed the subject, and moved on. Later that night, I overheard Claire talking to Eric near the bar. Ryan's a good guy, she said, but he's living in a fantasy world. This whole entrepreneur thing isn't realistic. He needs to find a real job. Eric had swirled his drink and said, he's always been the dreamer of the group. Some people just aren't meant for success. He'll come around eventually. Then Melanie chimed in with a giggle. Remember when he said he wanted to be the next Steve Jobs? At least he makes us look grounded. They all laughed and something in me cracked. These were supposed to be my closest friends, the people who knew me best, and they already saw me as a failure. I left early that night and tried for months to hold on to those friendships. I called Claire to grab lunch, but she was always busy. I texted Eric about coffee, but he left me on read every time. Melanie would post pictures online of the 3 of them hanging out together, and when I finally asked Claire about it, she shrugged it off, said they'd just run into each other. The last straw came 6 months later, when I found out through someone else that Eric had gotten married. Not engaged, married. The wedding had already happened, a quiet ceremony in Napa, with Claire and Melanie smiling in the photos. I hadn't even known he was seeing anyone. When I confronted Claire, she'd been cold. Ryan, we've all moved on. Eric didn't think you'd want to come anyway. You've been busy with that little app thing. That was the end of it. Now, years later, I stood in the doorway of my $6 million home, watching Claire shift uncomfortably while Eric avoided eye contact, pretending to study the security cameras. Melanie couldn't stop staring at the fountain in my front yard, her expression a mix of guilt and amazement. How'd you find me? I asked. I've made a point of keeping my address private since the IPO. Claire glanced down. We looked up property records, she admitted. It took some digging, but we found the LLC that owns this place and traced it back to you. I couldn't help a small grin. Property records, how quaint. So, I said finally, folding my arms, what exactly is it you want? Eric stepped forward, trying to summon his old salesman smile, though it looked more forced than ever. Ryan, we know it's been a long time, Claire began, her voice trembling just slightly. We wanted to apologize for how things ended between us. We were young and stupid and we made mistakes. Mistakes, I echoed, tasting the word like something foreign. That's one way to put it. The truth was, after they cut me off, I buried myself in work. That so-called pipe dream app they'd laughed about had been a productivity tool that used AI to help small businesses organize their operations. I spent endless 18-hour days coding in a cramped North Hollywood studio apartment, living on instant ramen and caffeine. The first version was clunky, but it worked. A few small companies tried it out and loved it, spreading the word through online forums and business groups. I kept improving it, fixing bugs, adding features, and listening to every bit of feedback I could get. 2 years after that engagement party, TechCrunch ran an article about my startup. 6 months later, I'd hit 100,000 users. 18 months after that, Microsoft came calling, with a $42 million acquisition offer. I took it, but that was just the beginning. I poured the money into a new venture, this time in cybersecurity for small and mid-sized businesses. The timing couldn't have been better. Data breaches were everywhere, and smaller companies had no affordable, practical protection. My second company took off, growing steadily over the next 6 years. We went public 2 years ago, and my stake alone was worth over $200 million. Add to that my investments in real estate and other startups, and while Forbes had listed me on their self-made under 35 feature last year. Still, I'd occasionally wondered what the old crew was up to. Social media makes it easy to keep tabs, even when people pretend they're ghosts. Claire had been laid off from her big marketing job during the 2020 recession, and now worked for a smaller firm with half the pay. Eric's father's investment company had been caught in a fraud investigation, not involving him directly, but enough to stain the family name. He was now a mid-level advisor at a regional bank. Melanie's gallery had shut down during the pandemic, and she was teaching art at a community college while running weekend workshops on the side. None of them were exactly failing, but their stories had lost that glossy shine they used to flaunt. Meanwhile, I was living in a glass-walled mansion overlooking the city, running a company with 800 employees, and dating a brilliant architect named Daniel Park. We saw the article about you in Fortune, Melanie said softly. The one about your new cybersecurity initiative for schools. That explained their sudden reappearance. That article had been flattering, complete with photos of my home office and a headline about my meteoric rise from nothing to tech powerhouse. The reporter had even emphasized how I'd built everything through grit and innovation. It was a nice piece, I said casually. Very thorough. Claire cleared her throat. Ryan, we just want you to know we're proud of you. We always knew you were smart and capable. I couldn't help but smile, an amused, quiet kind of smile. Did you, though? Because I distinctly remember being told I was living in a fantasy world. Something about chasing pipe dreams, wasn't it? The color drained from Claire's face. Eric's gaze dropped to his shoes. Melanie's mouth fell open just a little. You heard that, Eric muttered. It wasn't really a question. I did, I said. Among other things. You three weren't exactly subtle about how little faith you had in me. I leaned against the doorframe, feeling more at ease than I had all afternoon. In a strange way, this was therapeutic. Look, I continued, I get why you're here. Things haven't gone quite as planned for you, and you've realized your old friend, the one who was never meant for success, is now worth more than all of you combined. So you're hoping a heartfelt apology might open a few doors, right? Maybe an investment? A job? A loan? It's not like that, Claire protested, though even she didn't sound convinced. Isn't it? I asked lightly. Claire, your firm is hanging by a thread. I actually looked into hiring you for a product launch once, until I saw your client list has shrunk by half, and your biggest account's thinking of walking. Eric, word around finance circles is you've been struggling to keep up with mortgage payments after the divorce. And Melanie, community college teaching pays what, 40 grand a year? Their expressions froze in a mix of shock and humiliation. I'd done my research, of course. When you have money and the right connections, information is easy to come by. How do you even know all that? Eric asked quietly. The same way I know about your father's SEC settlement, Claire's mother's hospital bills, and Melanie's student loan default from last year, I said simply. I like to stay informed about people who used to matter to me. That wasn't entirely true. I'd only dug deeper after seeing them show up at my gate, but a few calls to the right people had filled in the blanks nicely. We made mistakes, Ryan, Claire said again, this time with tears in her eyes. We were jealous, competitive, and cruel. We're sorry. Honestly, we're sorry. I studied her, unmoved. Are you sorry for how you treated me? I asked. Or sorry because you were wrong about me? The silence that followed was heavy. A cool breeze rustled through the palm trees, and in the distance, I could hear the hum of cars on the highway below. Both, Melanie whispered. We were terrible friends, and we misjudged you completely. I looked at her, trying to read her face. Melanie had always been the kindest of the three, even when she went along with their cruelty. Her eyes were red and tired, and for the first time in a decade, I believed she might actually mean it. Do you remember what you said about me making you look good by comparison? I asked quietly. Melanie winced, guilt flashing across her face. Yeah, she said softly. I remember. And now? I pressed. She took a shaky breath. Now I think we made ourselves look bad next to you. We always did. Her honesty caught me off guard. It wasn't something I'd expected from any of them. Eric and Claire still had that uneasy, calculating tension about them, but Melanie, she looked genuinely remorseful. Ryan, Eric began, stepping a little closer to the door. We know we don't have any right to ask this, but things have been rough lately. If there's any way you could help us. Help you how? I asked, my tone steady but cool. Maybe job openings at your company? Or advice on investments? Or... He trailed off, realizing just how transparent it sounded. I looked at them standing there. Three people who had once made me feel small and foolish, now lined up like worshippers outside a temple, waiting for mercy. And unexpectedly, I felt something I hadn't in years: pity. The image that hit me next was sharp and immediate. Me, sitting on the floor of my tiny North Hollywood apartment the night after Eric's engagement party, surrounded by piles of code printouts and empty energy drink cans. I'd been crying so hard I could barely breathe when I called my mom back in Ohio. They don't believe in me anymore, I choked out. They think I'm a joke. She'd paused, then said in that calm, patient tone she always used when I was being dramatic. Sweetheart, sometimes people can only see as far as their own limitations. That doesn't mean you have to make them yours. Back then I thought she was just trying to make me feel better. But standing here now, staring at the same people who had once seemed so far ahead of me, I realized she'd been handing me the truth all along. Those first years out of college had been brutal, lonely, exhausting, and unforgiving. Not just because of how they'd shut me out, but because building something from nothing is a kind of pain no one warns you about. I paid rent by freelancing as a web developer during the day, and coded my app every night until sunrise. My social life vanished, not only because my old friends wanted nothing to do with me, but because I didn't have the time or energy for anything else. There were months when I lived on peanut butter sandwiches and dollar store noodles because every cent went into my project. I remembered one low point especially well. The night my laptop died and I couldn't afford a new one. For 3 weeks, I coded on an ancient public computer at the library, staying until closing every night. The librarian, Mrs. Rodriguez, finally asked what I was working on. When I explained, she frowned kindly and said, "Mijo, maybe you should find a steady job first. This computer stuff, it's risky." She hadn't meant it cruelly. She was worried for me. But even the well-meaning couldn't see what I saw. That's when I learned something that changed my life. Vision is a lonely gift. Most people only recognize success once it's already visible. They can't see it while it's being built. I thought of Eric's smug expression when I'd once told him I wanted to change the world through technology. Everyone thinks they're going to be the next Silicon Valley genius, he'd said. 90% of startups fail, you know. You're setting yourself up for disappointment. What he never understood was that I wasn't afraid to fail. What terrified me was regret. The thought of looking back someday, wondering what if, scared me far more than falling flat on my face ever could. The real irony, though, was that Eric, the pragmatic one, the realist, had actually gambled more than I ever did. He'd staked his future on his father's firm, on the old boys' network, on the world never changing. When that company collapsed under investigation, Eric was left stranded. No transferable skills, no network outside that corrupted circle, no backup plan. I meanwhile had spent every one of those years building something that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. Every late night, every bug fix, every pitch meeting. It all added up to value no one could take from me. Claire shifted uncomfortably on the doorstep, breaking my thoughts, and I was pulled back to another memory I hadn't visited in years. I'd run into her at a Starbucks in Beverly Hills, maybe 6 months after the engagement party. She'd been with 2 women I didn't recognize. Perfect hair, perfect nails, the kind of women who measured worth in handbags. "Ryan," she'd said, too brightly. "Wow, how are you? Still working on that little app of yours?" That phrase, little app had stung worse than if she'd insulted me outright. It was the verbal equivalent of patting me on the head. "Actually," I'd said, trying not to sound defensive, "we just passed 10,000 users." One of her friends had giggled. 10,000? That's cute. "Claire, didn't your last campaign reach 2 million? Claire had looked uneasy but hadn't said a word in my defense. "Different industries," she'd shrugged. "Ryan's always been more of a niche guy." Niche. As if building something meaningful for a smaller audience was inferior to flooding people's feeds with forgettable ads. That word haunted me for months, not because of how cruel it was, but because a part of me had believed it. Maybe 10,000 users wasn't impressive. Maybe I was deluding myself. But then came 100,000, 500,000, and eventually Microsoft knocking at my door. That was the difference between me and Claire, between me and all of them. They only valued success once it came wrapped in validation, while I'd learned to build mine long before anyone else could see it. She measured success by reach, how many eyes landed on her work. I measured success by impact, how many lives were genuinely improved by what I built. Her marketing campaigns might have reached millions, but they were designed to vanish the moment people made a purchase. My app, on the other hand, was built to become part of people's daily routines, something useful enough that they couldn't imagine working without it. When Microsoft bought my company, the head of their small business division told me something that stuck with me ever since. Most entrepreneurs create products for themselves and hope the world wants them. You built something for others and made it so good that you wanted it too. That's the difference between a vanity project and a real business. I remembered that conversation word for word. It had been the first time someone put into language what I'd instinctively known from the beginning. Melanie, the youngest of the 3, had probably hurt me the most back then, because I genuinely respected her opinion. She'd studied art, and I'd always thought she'd understand the creative process, the vulnerability of putting something into the world and praying it mattered. But when she'd joked that I made them look good by comparison, she'd exposed something ugly in herself. She didn't crave success. She craved superiority. She wasn't driven to create something meaningful. She just wanted to feel like she was doing better than the people around her. Over the years, I'd watched that same bitterness bleed through her life online. Her social media posts became a steady stream of schadenfreude, celebrating when old classmates didn't get into grad school, when coworkers were laid off, when mutual acquaintances went through breakups. She had this unsettling hunger for other people's failures. When her gallery shut down during the pandemic, I'd actually felt bad for her. Despite everything, I didn't want any of them to fail. But her posts grew darker, full of rants about privilege and how real artists were being replaced by influencers and tech money. She never took responsibility for the fact that her gallery hadn't failed because of the system. It had failed because she alienated the very people who wanted to buy from her. I'd even heard that she'd gained a reputation for talking down to anyone who didn't already know everything about postmodern art theory. Teaching at a community college was probably the best thing that could have happened to her, though I doubted she saw it that way. Maybe working with students who actually wanted to learn would remind her why she'd fallen in love with art in the first place. Looking at the 3 of them now, standing fidgety and uncertain on my doorstep, I saw exactly how their choices had shaped their lives. Eric's arrogance had made him reckless and unprepared for real challenges. Claire's obsession with image had left her with no depth, no substance, no lasting skills. And Melanie's bitterness had corroded her talent until all that was left was resentment. Meanwhile, every hardship I'd faced had sharpened me. When investors turned me down, I learned to pitch better. When users complained about bugs, I learned to code more precisely. When competitors appeared, I learned to innovate faster. My success wasn't built on genius, it was built on resilience. On showing up when no one believed in me. On turning every failure into a lesson instead of an excuse. 10 years ago, I would have done anything for their approval. I cried myself to sleep too many nights wondering why people who claimed to love me could discard me so easily. But standing here now with them looking small and lost, I realized something liberating. I didn't need their validation anymore. I'd already earned it from the only person whose opinion really mattered, myself. "Let me tell you what's going to happen," I said, my voice calm and steady. "You're going to leave my property and you're not going to contact me again. No more investigators, no surprise visits, no showing up at my office or any event I attend." "Ryan, please," Claire started. "I'm not finished." I cut her off. "You three made a choice 10 years ago. You decided I wasn't worth your time because you thought I was a loser chasing unrealistic dreams. That choice has consequences. You don't get to undo it now that those dreams paid off." I paused, watching their faces crumble under the weight of it. Eric's jaw was tight with anger. Claire was crying, mascara running. Melanie just looked tired, accepting maybe. "However," I added, "I'm not completely without compassion. Melanie, you said you're teaching art classes at the community college. My foundation has a program that provides supplies and equipment to underfunded schools. If you're genuinely interested in helping kids, and not just looking for a handout, submit a proposal through official channels. Don't mention our past. Let your work speak for itself." Melanie's eyes widened with surprise and something like gratitude. "What about us?" Eric demanded. "You're really going to leave us hanging after everything we meant to each other?" I couldn't help but laugh. "Everything we meant to each other? Eric, you dumped me because I lacked ambition. Now you're standing on my doorstep asking for help, because I turned out to have more ambition than you ever dreamed of." The irony's almost poetic. "People change," he muttered. "We've all grown up since then." "Have you?" I said, tilting my head. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've just gotten desperate." I took a step back and began to close the door. "Goodbye, Claire. Goodbye, Eric. Melanie, I meant what I said about the proposal." "Wait," Claire cried, her voice cracking. "Ryan, we were friends for 15 years. Doesn't that count for something?" Claire asked, her voice cracking. I paused with my hand still on the door handle. "You know what counts for something?" I said quietly. "The 10 years I spent building something incredible, something none of you cared enough to support or even ask about. That's what counts. And that's not my loss anymore, it's yours." I closed the door, turned the deadbolt and walked to the window. Outside they were still standing there. Eric was waving his arms, clearly angry about something, while Claire dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Melanie just stared at the door, motionless, as if hoping I might come back and let them in. Eventually, they trudged back to their car, a beat-up Honda that looked wildly out of place in my driveway, and drove off into the afternoon. Watching them go, I felt something unexpected. A strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. For years I'd imagined this exact moment, rehearsed all the things I'd say if I ever got the chance to confront them. But now that it had actually happened, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt quiet. My phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Daniel. Asterisk, how was your afternoon? Still coming to dinner with my parents tonight? Asterisk, I smiled and typed back. Asterisk, afternoon was interesting. I'll tell you about it later. You still making those dumplings I like? Asterisk, Daniel's parents were good people, the kind you feel lucky to know. His mom, Dr. Linda Park, was a pediatric surgeon who admired the education programs my foundation funded for underprivileged schools. His dad, Robert, a retired literature professor, loved talking about everything from business ethics to old sci-fi novels. They never made me feel like I had to prove anything to them. They just saw me for who I was. A woman who'd worked hard and made something of herself. That was what real connection looked like. People who lifted you up instead of tearing you down. People who celebrated your success instead of resenting it. I went upstairs to get ready, catching sight of myself in the full-length mirror. The reflection staring back wasn't the uncertain 22-year-old who'd once cried herself to sleep after a party full of so-called friends. This was a confident woman, self-made, successful, and genuinely happy. As I chose my outfit, I found myself thinking about the paths our lives had taken. Claire, Eric, and Melanie had all played it safe, choosing predictability over possibility. They'd mocked my ambition because it made them uncomfortable, because it reminded them of everything they weren't brave enough to try. What they never understood was that success isn't about money or headlines. It's about becoming the version of yourself you were meant to be. It's about pushing through fear and doubt and rejection to create something that matters. They saw my goals as unrealistic because they couldn't imagine a reality bigger than their own. When I talked about changing the world with technology, they heard delusion. But what they were really hearing were their own limits echoing back at them. The saddest part was, if they'd believed in me back then, really believed, I would have taken them along for the ride. I would have invested in their ideas, mentored them, shared every success. But instead they tried to tear me down. And in doing so, they built the walls that kept them out of the future they could have had. My phone rang, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was Elena, my housekeeper, calling from her weekend off. "Mr. Ryan, I'm sorry to bother you," she said, sounding uneasy. "But there were some people asking around about you in the neighborhood earlier. They showed me a picture, asked if I knew where you lived." My stomach tightened slightly. "When was this?" "About an hour ago. They said they were old friends trying to surprise you. They seemed polite, but something felt off." I smiled, shaking my head. "They already found me, Elena. But thank you for letting me know. If anyone else comes around asking questions, please contact me right away." "Of course, sir. Have a good evening." After hanging up, I realized the three of them had probably been planning this for weeks. They'd dug through property records, traced the LLC that owned my home, maybe even hired someone to help find me. They'd rehearsed their lines, practiced their sad faces, and probably convinced themselves it would all sound sincere. But it hadn't been sincere. It had been calculated. They'd come here hoping to play on nostalgia, to make me feel guilty enough to give them something. Instead, they'd walked into a brick wall of reality, a version of me that no longer craved their approval. That realization made me smile. I finished getting dressed and went downstairs to wait for Daniel. Through the kitchen window, the lights of Los Angeles stretched out like a sea of stars. Each one felt like a reminder of possibility, of all the dreams that could still be built. 20 minutes later, I saw Daniel's car pull into the driveway. I grabbed my purse and stepped outside, locking the door behind me. "You look amazing," he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "Good day." "Actually, yeah," I said, smiling. "I'll tell you everything over dinner." As we drove down the winding road toward Beverly Hills, the city spread out before us, glittering in the dusk. Every light, every tower, every stretch of highway felt like a piece of my own story. Every rejection, every sleepless night, every heartbreak had built the person sitting in that passenger seat. Somewhere between the laughter and the quiet, I realized the truth I'd been circling around all evening. The turning point in my life hadn't been when Microsoft bought my first company, or when my second one went public, or even when I bought this house. It had happened long before that, about 3 years into building my first app. I'd been invited to speak at a small tech conference down in San Diego. It wasn't glamorous, maybe 200 people in a hotel ballroom. But that day, surrounded by other hungry dreamers and scrappy entrepreneurs, something in me shifted forever. But it had been the first time anyone had ever asked me to tell my story in public. I remember standing behind that podium, staring out over the rows of faces, and feeling this wave of emotion hit me. It wasn't nerves, it was realization. I'd come a long way from the night I'd been sitting on the floor of my studio apartment, crying over the friends who didn't believe in me. I wasn't rich yet, or famous, or even particularly successful by most standards. But I had users who genuinely loved what I'd made, a handful of employees who believed in what we were building, and investors who were willing to take a risk on my vision. During the Q&A, a woman in the front row raised her hand and asked, "What advice would you give to someone whose friends and family think they're crazy for chasing an impossible dream?" I'd thought of Claire, Eric, and Melanie as I smiled and said, "First, make sure you're not actually crazy." The audience laughed. "But seriously, if you've done your homework, if you understand your market, and if you're solving a real problem for real people, then the only opinions that matter are your customers." Friends and family mean well, but that doesn't make them qualified to judge your ideas. Afterward, the same woman came up to me. She looked to be in her 50s, with streaks of gray in her hair and calloused hands that told a story of hard work. "I just wanted to thank you," she said. "My daughter thinks I'm having a midlife crisis because I want to start a catering business. Your talk reminded me that she's never run a business, so why am I letting her opinion stop me?" 6 months later, she sent me a Facebook message with pictures from her first big catering event. "You changed my life," she wrote. Asterisk, not just with your advice but with your example. If someone young enough to be my daughter can build a tech company from nothing, then I can certainly figure out how to cook for rich people. Asterisk, that message meant more to me than any award, article, or check I'd ever received. It was the first time I truly understood that success isn't just about proving your doubters wrong. It's about inspiring others to ignore theirs. I thought about something Daniel had told me once. "Your real talent isn't just technology," he'd said. "It's seeing potential where other people see obstacles. You don't just build companies, you build confidence. In your team, your users, and everyone who hears your story." Maybe that's what had unsettled my old friends so much. It wasn't my ambition itself, it was my certainty. My refusal to bow to their idea of what was realistic had threatened the comfort they found in playing it safe. People crave predictability. They like knowing where they stand in the hierarchy of things. When someone refuses to accept the limits they've all agreed on, it throws their whole world into question. If I could succeed after they'd written me off, then what did that say about the excuses they'd built their lives around? I thought about Eric in particular, and how he'd reacted the first time I'd mentioned wanting to start a company. He'd laughed, not cruelly, but in that condescending way adults laugh when a kid says they want to be an astronaut or a rock star. "Ryan, do you even know how many startups fail every year? Do you have any idea how much capital you'd need? How would you even compete with established companies that already dominate the market?" Every word had been aimed at showing me why it couldn't work, not how it might. He'd never asked the questions that mattered. "What problem are you solving?" Or "How will you stand out?" Because he wasn't curious. He was afraid. Back then, I thought his doubts came from concern. Now I knew better. They came from fear that if I succeeded, it would expose how small his own dreams really were. The truth was, Eric never had extraordinary ambitions. His biggest goal was to follow in his father's footsteps, maybe grow the family firm a little. When that safety net collapsed, he was lost because he'd never learned how to build something from scratch. Claire had her own kind of limitation. She was brilliant at reading trends, at understanding what people already wanted. Her marketing instincts were sharp but never innovative. She could craft a perfect campaign around an existing product, but she couldn't imagine something entirely new. She lived by the rules of the market instead of rewriting them. When I first told her about my app, she'd frown thoughtfully and said, "People need to know what category a product fits into. If you can't explain it in one sentence, no one will buy it." I remember smiling politely but thinking of the iPhone. Who had that competed with when it first launched? A BlackBerry? An iPod? A digital camera? All of them and none of them. It had created a new category entirely. My app had done the same. It wasn't just for project management or communication or time tracking. It was all of those things woven together into something that actually made people's work lives easier. Claire couldn't see that because she thought like a marketer instead of a user. Melanie, though, hers was different. Her limitation wasn't intellectual. It was emotional. She did understand what I was building. She just couldn't stand the idea that I might actually pull it off. Her problem had never been lack of vision, it was envy. My belief in myself had forced her to confront her lack of belief in herself, and that, more than anything, was what had driven her to turn on me. I remembered a conversation with Melanie during our senior year of college, back when I first started talking seriously about launching a startup. She'd been working on her senior art project, a series of paintings exploring identity and authenticity in digital spaces. "The thing is," she'd said, swirling paint on her palette, "everyone thinks they're going to change the world with technology, but most of it just makes people more disconnected from real human experiences." It was a thoughtful critique, and I genuinely respected her perspective, even though I didn't agree. But then she'd added, "I think you're romanticizing the whole startup thing because it seems more glamorous than getting a regular job like the rest of us." That was when her real feelings showed. She wasn't worried about society losing touch with humanity. She was resentful that I might end up getting more recognition than her. The sad thing was, Melanie had been incredibly talented. Her work was striking, emotional, and full of insight. Her ideas about the intersection of art and technology were years ahead of their time. If she'd used that creativity to collaborate with me instead of compete, she could have been part of something extraordinary. In those early days, I used to picture her designing our user interface, bringing her understanding of color, balance, and psychology to our product. She would have been amazing at it. But by the time I had the power to offer her a role like that, the friendship was long gone. Now she was teaching art at a community college, not a failure by any stretch, but for someone who once dreamed of gallery shows and glowing reviews, it probably felt like settling. I couldn't help but wonder if she ever thought about the path she'd chosen, or the one she'd closed off because she couldn't bring herself to root for me. As we pulled into Daniel's parents' driveway, he reached over and squeezed my hand. "You've been quiet," he said softly. "Still processing the afternoon?" I nodded, watching the lights from the porch reflect on the car's hood. In a way, yes. Because the truth was, Jessica, Marcus, and Rebecca, Claire, Eric, and Melanie in my version had each played a role in shaping the person I became. Their cruelty had fueled my determination. Their abandonment had forced me to rely on myself. Their mockery had made me double down on the vision they said would never work. I realized, almost with amusement, that I owed them a strange kind of gratitude. If they'd been kinder, more supportive, if they believed in me back then, maybe I wouldn't have fought so hard to prove them wrong. Maybe I would have been satisfied with a smaller life, a smaller dream. But their rejection had become the spark that ignited everything. Still, that was a truth I'd never share with them. Some lessons are best learned through consequence, and they were finally living theirs. Over dinner, I told Daniel's parents about the unexpected visit. Dr. Park's brow furrowed. "The nerve of showing up at your house after 10 years, she said. "And with an agenda, no less." Her husband nodded. "People show their real character when they're desperate," he said. "But it sounds like they revealed theirs long ago. You just got confirmation today." Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand again. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. "That couldn't have been easy." "Actually," I said with a small smile, "it was easier than I expected. I think I needed that closure more than I realized." And it was true. For all my success, a small part of me had carried their rejection like a splinter under the skin, something that didn't stop me from moving forward, but never quite healed either. No matter how many awards or magazine covers came my way, there had always been a faint whisper in the back of my mind. Asterisk, maybe they were right about you. Asterisk, but seeing them today, nervous, regretful, and hollowed out by their own choices, finally silenced that voice for good. I wasn't the failure they predicted. They were the ones who'd failed, to see, to believe, to grow. On the drive home, Daniel asked, "Do you think you'll hear from them again?" I thought for a moment. Maybe from Melanie. She seemed sincere, and I meant what I said about the foundation. But the other two? I doubt it. Their pride's too bruised. "And if they do reach out again?" he asked. I smiled faintly, watching the city lights streak by through the window. "Then I'll handle it the same way I did today, calmly, clearly, and with the full awareness that I don't owe them a thing." When we got home, I stood once again in the foyer beneath the chandelier that had witnessed the whole confrontation earlier that day. The marble floor gleamed softly in the light, a quiet symbol of everything I'd built for myself. This was my sanctuary, earned, not gifted. Tomorrow I'd wake up and go back to work, back to building, back to creating. Because that's what I did. I turned rejection into drive and doubt into empire. Somewhere across the city, I imagined the three of them lying awake, replaying our conversation, maybe even wondering what might have been if they'd chosen differently. But that was their burden, not mine. I had no more space left in my life or my heart for people who only believed in me after success made it safe to do so. The girl they dismissed as naive and unrealistic had become the woman they needed favors from. And that woman had looked them in the eye, smiled politely, and closed the door. It was, I realized as I went upstairs to bed, the most satisfying conversation I'd ever had. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the city as I drank my coffee on the terrace, the skyline glittering in the distance. I felt lighter than I had in years. There's something profoundly freeing about finally closing a chapter that's lingered open too long. As I sipped my coffee, I realized that for all this time, I'd been unconsciously saving a little piece of my heart for those three, for the apology that never came, for the friendship that never healed. But now that space was empty, and in its place was peace. Now that space was free, and I could fill it with people who actually deserved to be there. My phone buzzed with an email notification. To my surprise, it was from Rebecca Walsh, sent several hours earlier at 3:47 a.m. She must have been up all night thinking about our encounter. Sarah, I know you said to go through official channels, but I wanted to tell you something first. What we did to you was unforgivable, and I've regretted it every day for 10 years. Seeing you yesterday, seeing the incredible life you've built, just made me realize how much we lost when we lost you. I'm not asking for forgiveness or friendship. I know I don't deserve either. But I wanted you to know that you were always better than we gave you credit for. And I'm sorry it took me this long to say so. I'll submit a proper proposal to your foundation this week. Thank you for giving me even that much of a chance. Rebecca. I read the email twice, then forwarded it to David with a note. One of them seems to actually get it. He texted back almost immediately. People can change. Doesn't mean you owe her anything, but it's nice to see real accountability. He was right, of course. Rebecca's message felt different from the calculated performance Jessica and Marcus had put on at my door. This felt like genuine remorse rather than a strategic move. But it didn't change anything fundamental. Rebecca had still laughed at my dreams, still helped push me out of our circle, still made me feel small during one of the most vulnerable periods of my life. The fact that she regretted it now was nice, I supposed. But it didn't entitle her to forgiveness, friendship, or any place in my life. I decided not to reply. If she wanted to submit a proposal to my foundation, she could do it through the proper channels like anyone else. Her work would speak for itself, and if it genuinely helped the kids we serve, we'd consider it. But the personal connection she was reaching for, that ship had sailed a decade ago, and no late-night email could bring it back to port. As I got dressed for work, I found myself thinking about the larger lesson behind all of this. Success changes how others see you, but it shouldn't change how you see yourself. I hadn't built my empire to prove anything to Jessica, Marcus, or Rebecca. I built it to prove something to me. The validation I once craved from them meant nothing now, because I had earned something far better. Self-respect born of achievement, relationships based on mutual admiration instead of need, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing I can survive anything through determination and hard work. They had thought they were superior because they achieved traditional success early. But conventional success had turned them into conventional people, while my unconventional path had made me exceptional. Standing in my closet surrounded by designer clothes and polished shoes, I realized that the most valuable thing I owned wasn't material at all. It was the knowledge that I had taken their worst opinions of me and turned them into fuel for everything they said I couldn't be. Their visit hadn't been about forgiveness or friendship. It had been about seeking rescue from the fallout of their own narrow thinking. But some consequences can't be escaped, only endured. And some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. I chose a power suit for my board meeting and smiled at my reflection. The woman in the mirror was strong, successful, and fully aware of her worth. She had everything she needed, and she had earned every bit of it. As I walked downstairs to start another day building my empire, I realized that Jessica, Marcus, and Rebecca had given me one final gift. Absolute clarity about who belonged in my life and who never would again. And for that I was grateful.